The silence in the auditorium was so thick I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each second sounding like a hammer hitting a nail. The great hall of the biotech faculty was a place of prestige, lined with portraits of Nobel laureates who seemed to judge me from their gilded frames. I looked down at my hands, resting on the mahogany podium. They were preternaturally still. After 3 years of caffeine-induced tremors, 100-hour work weeks, and the kind of soul-crushing exhaustion that makes your bones ache, I was finally, chillingly calm. I looked up. In the front row sat Dr. Arthur Sterling. He was the definition of academic royalty. Tweed jacket, salt and pepper hairstyle to perfection, and that patronizing, fatherly smile that had been my North Star for 3 years. He wasn't just my advisor, he was the man who held the keys to my entire future. Beside him sat the Board of Regents, 5 individuals who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than listening to a 28-year-old Korean-American girl explain the nuances of CRISPR-based neural repair. "You may begin, G1, Sterling said. His voice was smooth, like expensive bourbon, carrying that effortless authority that only comes with a tenured position and a multi-million-dollar endowment. I clicked the remote. My first slide hit the massive screen. CRISPR-modified stem cell rejuvenation, a new path for degenerative neural repair. For the next 20 minutes, I was a machine. I spoke about the breakthroughs, the 3 a.m. eureka moments in the lab when the sequences finally aligned, and the statistical anomalies that proved my hypothesis wasn't just a theory, it was a revolution. I could see the board leaning in. I saw Dr. Eris, a woman known for tearing PhD candidates to shreds, actually nodding in approval. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated victory. I was going to be Dr. G1 Park. I was going to change the world. Then, I reached the climax of the presentation, the data set that proved the therapy worked on human analogous tissue without the catastrophic side effects everyone else in the field had hit. And as you can see from the latest results, stop. The word didn't just interrupt me, it sliced through the room like a surgical blade. It was Sterling. He hadn't just spoken, he had stood up. The fatherly smile was gone, replaced by a mask of grave, performative concern. He looked at the board, then at me, shaking his head with a look of profound disappointment. "I'm sorry, Jiwon," he said, his voice echoing in the hall. "I cannot, in good conscience, let this presentation continue. I've spent the morning reviewing the raw data logs from the Lab 4 servers. It appears, and it pains me to say this, that these results have been fabricated." Heavily. The room went dead. The silence was no longer clinical. It was suffocating. I felt the blood drain from my face, but not for the reason he thought. I looked at the board. Their expression shifted instantly from interest to cold, hard disgust. Academic fraud was the ultimate sin, a death sentence for a career that hadn't even started. "Fabricated?" Dr. Eris barked, her eyes snapping to Sterling. "Arthur, that's a massive accusation. Are you sure?" "I have the logs right here." Sterling sighed, reaching into his leather briefcase with a practiced, heavy-hearted motion. "Ji-won has been under immense pressure. I believe she adjusted the sequencing numbers to fit the desired outcome. The breakthrough she's describing doesn't exist. It's a ghost, a beautiful, fraudulent ghost." He looked at me, and for a split second the mask slipped. I saw it, the predatory gleam in his eyes. He didn't want to just fail me. He wanted to destroy my reputation so I could never work in another lab again. He wanted me blacklisted, an academic pariah, so I'd stay in his lab as a ghost researcher, a silent engine for his success, while he sold my fraud. We were using the media, sponsors, research to the highest bidder through the private biotech startup he'd been hiding from the university. He thought he had me. He thought the forever lab assistant would just bow her head and cry. He expected me to sign over the intellectual property rights in his office tonight in exchange for him covering up my mistake. "G1?" Dr. Eris asked, her voice like ice. "What do you have to say for yourself? This is your defense. Defend it." I looked at Sterling. He gave me a tiny, imperceptible nod. Give up, his eyes said. Accept the shame and stay under my thumb. I didn't back down. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. Instead, I reached for my laptop, which was still connected to the main projector. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. You're right, Dr. Starling, I said, my voice steady, projecting to the back of the room. There is a ghost in this room, but it's not my data. It's your ethics. And since we're talking about raw data logs, I think the board would be very interested to see what's actually on the Apex Genomics private server. I hit the enter key, but let I get the intent of what might be more like for myself. It was more like my data, because to understand how we got to this public execution, you need to understand what really happens in Lab 4 after the lights go out. To understand the weight of that moment in the Great Hall, you have to understand where I came from. I am the daughter of immigrants. My father worked 16-hour shifts at a dry cleaner in Queens, his hands perpetually smelling of chemicals and steam, just so I could have the books I needed. My mother cleaned offices until her back was permanently curved. For them, my acceptance into the PhD program under Dr. Arthur Sterling wasn't just a success. It was the American dream realized. Sterling was a titan. In the world of molecular biology, he was a rock star. He had the TED Talks, the covers of Wired, and a charisma that could make a room full of jaded scientists believe in magic. When he chose me as his lead researcher for the CRISPR project, I felt like I'd been anointed. The first year was a blur of adoration. I was his star. I worked 80, 90, sometimes 100 hours a week. I lived on protein bars and vending machine coffee. I was the first one in the lab at 5 a.m., checking the incubators, and the last one to leave, often sleeping on a cot in the break room. Sterling would walk in, smelling of expensive cologne and success, and clap me on the shoulder. G1, you're the sharpest tool I have, he'd say. We're going to change the world together. He took me to private dinners with investors. These weren't academic peers. They were venture capitalists in $5,000 suits. I'd stand there in my off-brand blazer, blushing as I explained complex genomic sequencing to men who only cared about the bottom line. Sterling would beam at me like a proud father. I would have followed him into a burning building. But the cracks started appearing in the second year. It started with the shadow server. University protocol was strict. All raw data had to be uploaded to the central university database for transparency. But Sterling told me to stop. He claimed that industrial espionage was rampant and that we couldn't trust the university's IT department. He had me set up a private encrypted cloud storage for our real results. This is for our protection, G1. He told me, his eyes sincere. When we publish, we'll move it back. But until then, we keep our secrets close. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was Arthur Sterling. The first real red flag happened when we were preparing a paper for Nature. I had run a series of tests on our latest viral vector. The results were incredible, but there was a hitch, a 4% margin of off-target effects. It wasn't a deal breaker, but it was significant. It needed to be addressed. I brought the report to his office, expecting a discussion on how to refine the process. Sterling looked at the graphs, picked up a red marker, and simply drew a line through the 4%. G1, honey, he said, his voice dropping to that soft, manipulative register. Science is as much about the narrative as it is about the numbers. These 4%, they're just statistical noise. Why clutter the reviewers' heads with noise? We'll optimize it in the next phase, remove it from the draft. I was stunned. But Dr. Sterling, that's not accurate. If someone tries to replicate this, they'll use my lab's resources and we'll guide them. He snapped. The warmth evaporated instantly. His face was a mask of cold academic superiority. Are you here to get a PhD, or are you here to be a moral philosopher? Because I can find 10 other students who would kill for your spot and won't question my editorial decisions. Choose. I chose the PhD. I deleted the data. That was the first time I felt the oily, sick taste of self-betrayal. After that, the requests became stranger. He wanted me to format my data into pitch decks rather than scientific reports. He started disappearing for weeks at a time, claiming he was at conferences. But I'd see photos on his wife's Instagram of him in Palo Alto, standing outside the offices of Tier 1 venture capital firms. Then came the night I forgot my keys. It was nearly midnight. The lab was silent, the blue lights of the sequencers pulsing like a heartbeat. I walked toward my desk but stopped when I saw light spilling from Sterling's office. The door was ajar. He was in there with a man I didn't recognize, a sharp-faced guy in a suit who looked more like a shark than a scientist. I stayed in the shadows. I shouldn't have listened, but my name caught my ear. "The girl is the problem," Sterling was saying. "She's too meticulous. She thinks this is pure research. She doesn't understand that we're building a product." "Is she going to be a problem for the patent filing?" a shark asked. "No," Sterling said, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. "The university contract says all IP generated in my lab belongs to the PI, me. But to make sure she doesn't get loud, I'm building a file, a little history of instability, some concerns about her data integrity. By the time she defends, she'll be so grateful I'm letting her pass that she'll sign whatever I put in front of her. If she doesn't, I'll ruin her. A fraud accusation from someone of my stature? She'll be lucky to get a job washing beakers in a high school. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My lungs seized. Every late night, every missed holiday with my parents, every sacrifice I'd made for our project was being weaponized against me. He wasn't just stealing my work. He was planning to preemptively murder my reputation to ensure I could never claim my share of the millions. No billions this therapy was worth. I didn't go home that night. I sat at my computer in the dark, my face illuminated by the glow of the screen. The betrayal was so deep it felt physical. I looked at the shadow server icon on my desktop. He thought I was a meticulous girl. He thought I was a tool. He didn't realize that being meticulous meant I noticed everything. I noticed that he reused the same password for his personal email that he used for the lab's admin account. I noticed that he kept a digital folder titled Apex that was hidden 3 layers deep in a directory for janitorial supplies. I opened it. What I found was a blueprint for a heist. He had already incorporated Apex Genomics. He had already promised 40% of the company to investors based on my research, which he had rebranded as his own independent discovery. He had emails discussing how to phase me out once the initial patent was granted. He even had a draft of the letter he would send to the ethics committee, the very one he had just used against me in the auditorium. I realized then that I wasn't just a student. I was a witness to a crime. I spent the next 6 months playing the part of the perfect, submissive student. I smiled when he criticized me. I brought him his favorite espresso. I even pretended to be confused by the very data I knew was perfect. But behind the scenes, I was working. I reached out to Kevin, a guy in the university's IT department who had a grudge against Sterling for being publicly humiliated by him over a slow internet connection. Kevin and I began building a different kind of shadow server. We tracked every edit Sterling made to my files. We logged every time he accessed the server from a Palo Alto IP address. I began embedding digital watermarks into my sequencing data, hidden code that was invisible to the naked eye, but would trigger a specific response if the file was ever moved to a non-university server. I was building a track, a digital guillotine. A week before my defense, Sterling called me into his office. He looked out the window at the campus, the sun setting over the ivy-covered walls. "G1," he said, sounding weary, "I'm very concerned about your progress. Your latest data. It looks erratic. I'm worried the board will see it as a lack of rigor. Perhaps you should take a leave of absence. Or," he paused, turning to me with a predatory smile, "you could sign this document. It's a joint venture agreement. It brings in outside expertise to help fix your mistakes. It would take the pressure off you. It was a total surrender of my rights." I looked him in the eye, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with suppressed rage. "I'll do whatever it takes to pass, Dr. Sterling." "Good girl," he said. He had no idea that I had just recorded that entire conversation. He had no idea that "good girl" was about to become the last thing he ever said to me in private. The final month before my defense felt like a psychological thriller where I was both the protagonist and the architect of my own potential ruin. Sterling had completely stopped being my mentor. He had become a warden. He was no longer content with just stealing my work. He wanted to break my spirit so thoroughly that I'd be too traumatized to ever speak up. He began a campaign of academic gaslighting that was so subtle, so surgical, that if I hadn't already seen his Apex files, I might have actually believed I was losing my mind. It started with the midnight audits. I'd arrive at the lab at 6 a.m. to find my workbench rearranged. It's a small thing to an outsider, but in molecular biology, precision is everything. My pipettes would be calibrated differently. My reagent bottles would be moved. It was a clear message. I can touch your world whenever I want, and you can't stop me. One Tuesday, I went to the freezer to pull my primary stem cell samples, the ones I'd been culturing for 8 weeks for the final validation study. The rack was empty. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. These weren't just cells, they were the physical proof of my 3 years of work. I ran to Sterling's office, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Dr. Sterling, the batch 47 samples are gone. They're just gone. He didn't even look up from his coffee. He just sighed, a sound of profound, weary disappointment. G1, we discussed this. You left the freezer door ajar on Friday. The samples thawed. They were non-viable. I had the lab tech dispose of them to prevent contamination. Your negligence is becoming expensive. I didn't leave it open, I whispered, the blood rushing to my ears. I checked it 3 times. I have a log. Then perhaps your log is as unreliable as your memory, he said, finally looking at me with those cold gray eyes. This is exactly what I was talking about. You're cracking under the pressure. Maybe we should postpone the defense. Another year as a researcher might do you some good. Get your head straight. I knew then that he had destroyed them himself. He was purging the evidence of my success so that my defense would rely solely on the digital data. Data he had already planned to reveal as fraudulent. He was stripping me of my physical proof, leaving me naked in front of the board. No, I said, my voice shaking with a rage I had to disguise as a sob. I'm ready. I'll redo the sequencing from the backup pellets. If you say so, he smirked. But don't say I didn't warn you when the board starts asking questions about your consistency. That night, I stayed in the lab until 4 a.m., but I wasn't doing research. I was meeting Kevin from IT in the server room. The air in there was freezing, hummed with the sound of 1,000 cooling fans. Kevin looked nervous. He knew that if we were caught, he'd lose his job and I'd be deported. I found it, Kevin whispered, pulling up a screen of code. He's been using a backdoor script. Every time you save a file to the university server, it creates a copy, sends it to his Apex Genomics cloud, and then runs a modifier on your local version. It's subtle, changing a 0.98 probability to a 0.88, just enough to make your results look promising but inconclusive. He's making you look like a mediocre scientist so he can swoop in later with the real data and look like a genius. Can you trace the IP? I asked. Better, Kevin grinned. I've linked the modifier script to his personal laptop's MAC address, and I've set up a mirroring protocol. Every time he changes one of your numbers, it gets logged in a hidden partition on the university's main security server, somewhere he has no admin rights to delete. I felt a cold shiver of relief. I wasn't just defending a thesis anymore. I was building a federal wire fraud case. But the pressure didn't stop. Sterling began rehearsing with me. These weren't helpful critiques. They were hour-long sessions of verbal abuse disguised as tough love. He would invite other department heads, friends of his who owed him favors, to sit in and tear my presentation apart. Your logic is circular, G1, one would say. Are you sure you understood the underlying chemistry? Another would sneer. Sterling would sit in the back, nodding solemnly. I've tried to guide her, but she's very resistant to correction. I'm worried she's too emotionally attached to a flawed hypothesis. I would go home to my tiny apartment, eat a bowl of cold rice, and stare at the wall. I was losing weight. My hair was thinning from the stress. My parents would call from Queens, asking if I was eating, if I was happy. I'd lie to them. I'm fine, Uma. Dr. Sterling is so helpful. I'm almost a doctor. I'd hang up and cry until I was dry heaving in the bathroom. The final straw came 48 hours before the defense. I was in the lab, finishing the last of the digital slides, when I saw Sterling's assistant, a quiet girl named Maya, looking at me with pure pity. G1, she whispered, checking to make sure the hallway was clear. I saw him in the office today. He was on the phone with a legal team from Apex. They were discussing a non-compete injunction. They're going to serve you with papers the second the board announces your grade. They want to legally bar you from working in gene therapy for 5 years. He wasn't just trying to steal the patent. He was trying to put me in a cage for half a decade. He wanted to make sure that by the time I was allowed to work again, the technology would have moved on and I'd be obsolete. Thanks, Maya, I said, my heart turning into a block of ice. I went to my computer. I messaged Kevin. Is the dead man switch ready? Kevin, ready. The second you enter the override code on the podium, it'll broadcast the entire Apex server content, the server logs, and the recorded audio of his good girl's speech directly to every member of the board and the university's legal counsel. No turning back. Me. Good. Let's burn it down. The day before the defense, Sterling came by my desk. He smelled of expensive cedarwood and smugness. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. Tomorrow was a big day, G1. Just remember, I'm the only reason you're even in that room. If you try to go off script, if you try to claim any individual ownership of the Apex data, I will destroy you before you can finish your sentence. Do we understand each other? I looked up at him, my eyes wide and feigning terror. Yes, Dr. Sterling, I understand. I'm nothing without you. He patted my cheek, a gesture so demeaning I felt bile rise in my throat. Exactly. See you at 9 a.m., Dr. to-be. He walked away, laughing. He thought he had won. He thought I was the good girl who would take the hit and disappear into the shadows. He didn't realize that a girl who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. I wasn't going into that auditorium to defend my thesis. I was going in to perform an autopsy on his career. The 24 hours leading up to the defense were a fever dream of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated spite. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sterling's smug face and heard his voice calling me a good girl. I spent the night in my tiny kitchen, surrounded by printed emails, server logs, and legal documents. My apartment looked like the room of a conspiracy theorist, but the conspiracy was real, and the villain was currently sleeping in a $5 million mansion bought with the blood and sweat of students like me. At 3 a.m., I had a moment of pure, paralyzing terror. I realized that if Kevin's script failed, or if Sterling had a countermeasure I hadn't seen, I wasn't just failing a PhD, I was going to prison. Sterling would sue me for defamation, the university would deport me, and I would be a disgraced nobody. I sat on the floor and put my head between my knees, breathing into a paper bag. My father's face flashed in my mind, his rough, calloused hands from the dry cleaners. He had worked 30 years for this day. If I lost, I wasn't just losing my career. I was losing his sacrifice. But then I remembered the off-target data. I remembered the 4% of genetic errors Sterling had forced me to delete. If that therapy went to market as it was, people would get sick. Real people. It wasn't just about my ego anymore. It was about the fact that Sterling was willing to gamble with human lives for a Series A funding round. The terror evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. I wasn't a victim. I was a whistleblower with a PhD-level understanding of the evidence. I arrived at the university at 7:30 a.m. The campus was quiet, shrouded in a thin morning mist. I went straight to the auditorium. I needed to be the first one there. I met Kevin behind the technician's booth. He looked like he'd been drinking coffee for 12 hours straight. Is it loaded? I whispered. The script is embedded in your presentation file, Kevin said, his voice low. The trigger is a specific key combination. CTL plus ALT plus SHIFT plus P. Once you hit that, it bypasses the local display and mirrors the Apex server content directly to the projector through the administrative override. It also triggers the mass email. You're sure about this, G1? This is nuclear. He chose the battlefield, Kevin, I said. I'm just bringing the heat. At 8:45 a.m., the board began to arrive. Dr. Eris walked in first, looking as formidable as ever in a sharp charcoal suit. She gave me a curt nod. Then came the others, professors I had admired for years, people whose papers I had memorized. They were the gatekeepers. And finally, Sterling entered. He looked magnificent. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, and carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my car. He walked up to me and patted my shoulder. That same condescending pat. "You look pale, G1. Don't let the nerves get to you. Just stick to the slides we reviewed. I've done the heavy lifting for the committee already. This is just a formality." A formality. He thought he had pre-bought my grade. He thought he had pre-bought the board. "I'll remember everything you taught me, Dr. Sterling," I said. I meant it. He had taught me exactly how a monster hides in plain sight. I climbed the stairs to the podium. The great hall felt massive, the ceiling stretching up into the shadows. I plugged in my laptop. My hands were steady. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. The defense began. For the first 20 minutes, I gave the performance and I turned into a big setting of the road and saw a 5-star breakout from my memory. I was articulate. I navigated the complex genomic sequences with a grace that made the board sit up. I could see them exchanging looks of genuine impressed surprise. I was proving that I was exactly who Sterling feared I was, a peer. I saw Sterling shifting in his seat. He didn't like how well I was doing. He wanted me to look shaky. He wanted me to look like I needed his protection. I reached the slide on a final validation results. The breakthrough. This was the moment we had. Rehearsed. The moment where I was supposed to present the sanitized data that Sterling had approved. I paused. I looked at the board. Then I looked at Sterling. He was leaning forward, a predatory smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He knew what was coming. He thought this was the moment he would spring his trap, the moment he would interrupt and accuse me of fraud based on the logs he had faked. He stood up. "I'm sorry, G1, he said, his voice projecting with practiced theatrical regret. "I cannot, in good conscience, let this continue." This was the hook moment. This was the exact point where he expected me to crumble. He went into his speech about fabricated results and immense pressure. He showed the board the logs that Kevin and I had watched him fake 3 nights ago. Dr. Aris looked at me, her face a mask of disappointment. "G1, what do you have to say for yourself?" This was it, the breaking point. "You're right, Dr. Sterling," I said, my voice echoing, vibrating with a power I didn't know I possessed. "There is fraud in this room, but it's not in my presentation. It's in yours." I didn't wait for his response. I hit the key combination, Control plus Alt plus Shift plus P. The screen behind me flickered for a second, then turned bright red. A new window opened, bypassing my PowerPoint. It was the file directory of the Apex Genomics private server. "What is this?" Dr. Aris demanded, standing up. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is Dr. Sterling's private company, and these," I clicked a folder, "are the original, unedited data logs. You'll notice the timestamps. They prove that Dr. Sterling has been systematically modifying my university research to make it look fraudulent while simultaneously filing for patents under his own company name using the actual successful results." The room erupted. Sterling's face went from smug to a sickly mottled purple in 3 seconds. "This is a hack," he screamed, his voice cracking. "She's compromised the system. Shut it down. I'm not hacking." "Dr. Sterling," I said, clicking the next file. "I'm testifying. Here's the audio recording of you asking me to sign over my IP rights in exchange for a passing grade. And if the board checks their emails right now, you'll find the full forensic audit of the university's server showing every single time your personal laptop accessed my files to change the numbers." I looked at him. The rock star was gone. In his place was a small, panicked man caught in a light he couldn't switch off. "You're done, Arthur," Dr. Aris said, her voice like a falling guillotine. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at him with a level of loathing that made the air feel cold. The breaking point was over. The collapse had begun. The chaos in the Great Hall was absolute, but it was a controlled burn, at least on my end. While Sterling was shouting about security breaches and malicious hacking, the board was already scrolling through their laptops and tablets. Kevin had timed the mass email perfectly. It wasn't just a dump of files. It was a curated, indexed dossier of corporate espionage and academic malpractice. "Everyone, please, stay calm," Dr. Aris commanded, her voice cutting through Sterling's frantic yelling. She turned to the university's legal counsel, who was sitting in the back of the room looking like he'd just seen a ghost. Mr. Henderson, I suggest you look at your inbox immediately. This isn't just a student dispute anymore. I stood there, still behind the podium, watching the man who had tried to bury me fall apart. Sterling was sweating now, his expensive tweed jacket looking suddenly ill-fitting and pathetic. He tried to move toward the podium to snatch my laptop, but Kevin's IT team had already remotely locked the hardware. You think this is clever? Sterling hissed at me, leaning over the front row, his face inches from mine. You've just committed a federal crime, G1. You've stolen proprietary corporate data. I'll have you in a cage before the sun sets. It's not proprietary corporate data, Arthur, Dr. Eris interrupted, her eyes glued to her screen. According to these logs, the work was performed in Lab 4 using NIH grant funding. That makes it university property. And according to these emails, you've been selling that property to private investors for months. That's not a security breach by the student. That's embezzlement and fraud by the Dean of Research. This was the nuclear option. I had spent months preparing. You see, I knew a simple accusation of he stole my work wouldn't be enough. In academia, the word of a tenured professor is gold, and the word of a grad student is dirt. To win, I had to make him a liability to the university's bottom line. I had to show the administration that he was the one stealing from them. The plan had started 6 months prior, during those long nights when I pretended to be confused. One day, or a month later, while Sterling thought I was failing, I was actually working with Kevin to map every single digital footprint Sterling left. We found that he was using university-funded cloud compute cycles to run simulations for Apex Genomics. That was a direct violation of federal law. I had also reached out, anonymously, to the shark lawyer I'd seen in Sterling's office. I didn't tell him who I was. I posed as a prospective investor asking for due diligence on the Apex patent. He had sent me a summary of their independent research. I compared that summary to my own lab notebooks, page by page, and highlighted the identical data pills. But the real poison hill was the 4% data dilution. In the dossier I sent to the board, I included the original files showing the off-target genetic effects Sterling had forced me to hide. I also included a draft of a letter I had already written to the FDA. I have a copy of this entire presentation and the supporting evidence already queued to be sent to the FDA and the NIH, I said, my voice cold and clear. If the university tries to sweep this under the rug to protect Dr. Sterling's reputation, the entire department will lose its federal funding. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about whether this institution wants to be an accomplice to medical fraud. The silence that followed was heavy. The board members looked at each other. They weren't just scientists. They were administrators. They were thinking about the millions of dollars in grants that would vanish if the NIH found out they were hiding safety data. They were thinking about the lawsuits from the investors Sterling had lied to. Sterling looked around the room, realizing that his friends were backing away from him like he was radioactive. G1, he said, his voice suddenly shifting back to that manipulative fatherly tone. Let's be reasonable. We can talk about this in my office. There's been a misunderstanding of the corporate structure. You're a co-founder. I was going to surprise you after the defense. You're part of Apex. I don't want to be a part of a lie, Arthur, I said. And I don't want your surprise. I want my degree. I want the patent and the university's name with me as the sole inventor, and I want you to stay away from my family. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. You have no idea how the world works, girl. You think a few emails change anything? I built this department. I am the one they come to for the billion-dollar deals. You're just a pair of hands. Actually, Dr. Eris said, standing up and closing her laptop with a definitive thud, you were the one they came to. Mr. Henderson, please escort Dr. Sterling to his office. On his access to the lab servers revoked immediately. I want his university-issued devices seized. And I want the campus police to stand by while he clears his personal effects. You can't do this, Sterling screamed as the legal counsel and a campus security officer approached him. Eris, you're making a mistake. She's a fraud. She's a liar. They let him out, his protests echoing down the hallway until they faded into a pathetic whimper. The Great Hall, once a place of my greatest fear, now felt like a cathedral of justice. Dr. Eris looked at me. There was no warmth in her eyes yet, only a grim professional respect. The defense is suspended for 1 hour while we review the legal implications of this additional data. But G1, don't go anywhere. We still have to decide if the research itself, the real research, is worth a doctorate. It is, I said, because for the first time in 3 years, the data on that screen is the truth. I sat down in the front row, in the seat Sterling had just occupied. My heart was pounding, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I pulled out my phone and sent a one-word text to my father. Soon, the hour-long recess felt like a lifetime. I sat in the empty auditorium, the ghost of my presentation still glowing on the massive screen. Kevin stayed in the booth, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he helped the university's forensic team lock down every single byte of data in Lab 4. Across the hall in the dean's conference room, I could hear the muffled shouts of Arthur Sterling. He wasn't going down without a fight. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. Finally, the doors opened. Dr. Eris and the board walked back in, accompanied by the university provost and a woman in a sharp navy suit, who I recognized as the head of the Office of Research Integrity. They didn't sit in the audience this time. They sat at the long table on the stage, looking down at me. G1 Park, the provost began, his voice heavy with the weight of the scandal that was about to break. In light of the evidence provided, specifically the recorded conversations, the server logs, and the safety data that was suppressed, the university has made a preliminary decision. He paused, looking at a folder in front of him. Dr. Arthur Sterling has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full termination hearing. We have also contacted the district attorney's office regarding the attempted embezzlement of university intellectual property. His tenure is effectively voided under the moral turpitude clause of his contract. A small spark of relief flickered in my chest, but I held my breath. I wasn't done yet. However, the provost continued. This leaves your research in a difficult position. By your own admission, the data presented in your official draft was sanitized. While we understand the duress you were under, we cannot award a PhD based on a presentation that was at one point misleading. I have the unedited raw data right here, I said, standing up and holding my laptop. I have the original sequencing, the error logs, and the corrected results for the 4% off-target effects. I spent the last 3 nights rerunning the simulations on a clean, independent server. I didn't just find the fraud. I fixed the science. Dr. Eris leaned forward, her eyes piercing. Show us. No more talk about Sterling. Show us the real CRISPR repair data. If you want this degree, you have to prove that you are the genius behind this technology, not just a whistleblower. For the next 45 minutes, I gave a master class. Without Sterling breathing down my neck, without the fear of his red marker, I explained the true complexity of the neural repair vector. I showed them how I had found a way to bypass the blood-brain barrier using a modified protein shell, a detail I had intentionally hidden from Sterling in my final weeks. As I spoke, I saw the skepticism on their faces melt into pure academic awe. I wasn't just a student anymore. I was the leading expert on a technology that could potentially cure Alzheimer's. When I finished, the room was silent. Dr. Eris looked at the other board members. They didn't even need to deliberate. Dr. Eris said, and for the first time she smiled, a small, genuine glimmer of pride. That was the most impressive defense I have witnessed in 20 years. Not because of the drama, but because of the science. Congratulations, Dr. Park. I felt the tears then, hot, stinging, and completely earned, but the confrontation wasn't over. I had one more stop to make. As I walked out of the auditorium, I saw Sterling being led down the main hallway by 2 campus police officers. He was handcuffed. The university had found out that he'd already moved $2 million of grant money into an offshore account for Apex Genomics. It wasn't just an academic dispute anymore. It was a felony. He saw me and stopped. The officers tried to pull him along, but he dug in his heels. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Gone was the polished mentor. He looked like a common thief caught with his hand in the register. You think you won? He spat, his voice raspy. You've destroyed the only person who could have made you famous. You'll be a footnote, G1. You'll be that girl who sued her advisor. No one will ever trust you in a lab again. You broke the code. I walked up to him, stopping just inches away. I was shorter than him, but in that moment, I felt like a giant. I reached out and adjusted his crooked tweed lapel, mimicking the way he used to do to me before we went into investor meetings. I didn't break the code, Arthur, I said, my voice a calm, deadly whisper. I just stopped following yours. And don't worry about my career. The board just granted me the patent, the entire patent. The university is setting up a dedicated lab for the project, and they've asked me to be the lead investigator. I leaned in closer, so only he could hear. And about being a footnote, I'm the one who wrote the history today. You're just the guy who got caught stealing from a good girl. Enjoy your new cell. I hear the lighting in federal prison is terrible for reading research papers. I turned my back on him and walked toward the light of the campus quad. I didn't look back to see him being hauled away. I didn't need to. The weight that had been crushing my chest for 3 years was gone. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, and for the first time in my life, the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like a promise. The dust didn't settle overnight. In the high-stakes world of Ivy League academia and multi-billion-dollar biotech, a scandal involving someone as prominent as Arthur Sterling is less like a ripple and more like a tectonic shift. It leaves cracks in everything it touches. For the first 6 months after that fateful defense, my life wasn't spent in a lab. It was spent in windowless conference rooms surrounded by lawyers from 3 different federal agencies. The investigation into Sterling's activities was like peeling a rotten onion. Every layer we removed revealed more decay. It turned out I was just the tip of the iceberg. The university's forensic accountants discovered that Sterling hadn't just been stealing from me. He had been running a sophisticated triple-dipping scheme. He was using NIH grant money to fund research, then charging the same hours to a secondary state grant, all while selling the exclusive rights to those same results to 5 different venture capital firms through Apex Genomics. He had created a house of cards built on my labor and the labor of 6 students before me who had been too scared to speak up. The legal battle was grueling. Sterling's defense team tried every dirty trick in the book. They attempted to characterize me as a disgruntled, unstable student who had fabricated the evidence out of spite because I couldn't handle the pressure of a PhD. They tried to claim that my hacking of the Apex server made all the evidence inadmissible. But they underestimated Kevin. My friend from IT hadn't just mirrored the server. He had recorded the digital handshakes that proved Sterling was accessing the files from his personal iPad while sitting in his vacation home in the Hamptons. The turning point in the court case came when the Department of Justice stepped in. They weren't interested in academic egos. They were interested in the $5 million of federal money Sterling had diverted into offshore accounts. When they presented the wire fraud charges, Sterling's rock star persona finally shattered. I sat in the courtroom and watched him, no longer the titan in the tweed jacket, but a gray, trembling man in a cheap suit. He took a plea deal, 7 years in a federal penitentiary, full restitution of stolen funds, and a lifetime ban from receiving federal research grants. His name was chiseled off the building, his honorary degrees were revoked, and he was officially erased from the university's history books. But while the legal system was dealing with the man, I was dealing with the fallout of the science. The university was in full damage control mode. They knew that if I walked away and took my knowledge to a rival school like MIT or Stanford, their reputation would never recover. The provost called me into his office, the same office where Sterling used to drink scotch and plan my downfall, and offered me a deal that broke every rule in the academic handbook. They bypassed the usual decade of postdoc, wandering, and junior faculty struggle. They offered me an associate professorship and the directorship of the newly formed Park Institute for Neural Regeneration. I was given a starting budget of $12 million and the keys to a brand new top-floor laboratory. But I had conditions. First, the patent for the CRISPR vector would be held by the university, but I would be the sole listed inventor with a 15% personal equity stake, money that would ensure my family's future for generations. Second, I wanted full oversight of the ethics committee. I wanted to make sure no student would ever have to choose between their degree and their conscience again. The most transformative moment, however, happened away from the cameras and the million-dollar labs. It happened on a humid Tuesday in Queens. I took the subway down to the old neighborhood, the folder with my official doctoral degree tucked under my arm. My parents' dry cleaning shop was as busy as ever. The air was thick with the smell of starch and industrial steam. I saw my father through the window, his back curved as he worked the heavy pressing machine. He looked so tired, so small in that sea of other people's clothes. I walked in, and when he saw me, he started to apologize for not having dinner ready. I just held up the folder. "Gad," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "stop the machine." He looked confused, but he turned it off. The sudden silence in the shop was deafening. I opened the leather portfolio and showed him the parchment. I translated the Latin for him, word by word. Doctor of Philosophy, Jiwon Park. I told him about the house I had just put a down payment on, a place in the hills of New Jersey with a porch and a yard where he could finally sit in the sun. I told him he was never going to press another shirt as long as he lived. He didn't cheer. He didn't even smile at first. He just leaned against the counter and cried, the deep, silent heaving of a man who had carried the world on his shoulders for 30 years and finally felt the weight lift. That afternoon, we walked out of that shop together and locked the door for the last time. Today, 3 years after that explosion in the Great Hall, my life is unrecognizable. My lab is a sanctuary. I have 20 graduate students working under me, and I treat them like colleagues, not tools. We've moved into phase 2 clinical trials. Last month, we saw the first patient, a grandmother who hadn't recognized her own daughter in 5 years, say her name. It was a small moment in a hospital room, but it was worth more than every patent and award in the world. I still have a copy of the letters Sterling sent me from prison. He tried one last time to manipulate me, asking for mercy and suggesting we collaborate on a book about the scandal. I didn't reply. I didn't even burn it. I framed the envelope and hung it in the lab's break room, not as a trophy, but as a warning. It sits right next to our mission statement. The data is the truth, and the truth is the only thing that matters. Every morning, I walk past the portrait of the former dean. The spot where Arthur Sterling's picture used to hang is now a digital display, showing the real-time recovery statistics of our trial patients. It's a constant reminder that power is fleeting, but the work we do for others is permanent. I am Dr. Jiwon Park. I am no longer the meticulous girl Sterling tried to break. I am the architect of a new era in medicine. And every time I look into a microscope and see the cells repairing themselves, I know that the best revenge isn't just winning, it's thriving in a world that tried to tell you that you didn't belong.